Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Stronger with Time. I'm your host, Tony Boutagy. In today's episode, we took a pause from our interviews and I recapped the last 8 episodes. So if you're new to Stronger with Time, it gives you a bit of a taste for who I've spoken to and the topics which we've covered. If you've already listened to all 8 interviews, it might just give you a chance and an insight to see what I took from these leading researchers and coaches. Without further delay, please enjoy this conversation with myself.
Well, welcome, Tony, to the first summary podcast for Stronger with Time. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, Kat. How are you doing?
I'm doing wonderful, thank you. What has been happening in your world?
Well, we planned to do this summary podcast several weeks ago, maybe after 4 episodes had been recorded, but we got swept away with doing the Menopause course and time made a fool of me. So here we are at 8 episodes in, doing a bit of a summary.
And it has been amazing listening to all the episodes and all the phenomenal speakers you have. So I'm very excited to hear the full summary from your lens. So what is this summary podcast about today?
I'm sure there's a lot of people who have been watching on social media and thinking, oh, that's interesting. I'll go and listen to that podcast. And then when they open it up, they realize there's 6 or 8 to catch up on, and they're an hour each. Therefore, I think a lot of people want to know, well, what's the big take-home messages from these? Or in particular, what did Tony take from these conversations? And that's what this summary podcast is meant to be. And I apologize. We're meant to do it after every 4 rather than after every 8.
Well, we have finally gotten here. So one final question before we dive in. What actually made you decide to do this podcast series?
I had always been resistant to doing a podcast, and I had been asked over the years to do one. But I thought there's just so many good ones already on the market in health and fitness and in training, and then in all the different things that I'm interested in, like weightlifting and cycling and triathlon. And I always thought I would never do it until eventually the amount of misinformation and the questions that I got on a daily basis about how should females train or eat or very specific protocols. I was answering these questions every day in all the spare time that I had, that I thought it might be better to interview the researchers or the coaches from whom I get the information that I use every day. And I would then interview them, ask them the questions that were on my mind or that I'm asked every day, and put that out to the public. So that's why I finally did the plunge and asked all of the really greatest minds who are doing work in very specific fields that we just rely on. And I realized very quickly that a lot of that work is not making its way to the general public. There are people who have got very loud voices and they place themselves as the expert in training or females' health and fitness, but actually they're not at all, and they're very much misrepresenting the research. And this podcast gives a platform and a voice to those people doing the work to say, this is what we're doing and this is what we find and this is how it applies. And I think where I have a place is somebody who is a scientist and a coach. I can speak that language and explain it to the public on how we do this in the real world.
Yeah, and I tend to agree that I think, especially with your course that you've been running recently, that ability that you have to speak both languages, both the scientific world and the coaching world, has been really helpful for both your students and I think the listeners as well. And you may have just touched on this a little bit, but, you know, there are so many speakers or scientists or experts out there. What was your process or thinking behind selecting the speakers?
The background is very simple. I got told every day that I was confusing the public. And when I tried to unpack that statement, I, as a coach of 30 years, would talk about information that coaches just accept as truth and how we've gone about doing things, the collective we, over many decades, whether it's training for the general public or specific conditioning for Olympic world-class athletes. And my viewpoint is not a minority viewpoint. It's the consensus on how we approach the training journey, things we consider, and the various approaches that we use. It's based part on what the scientific literature has found in humans, but also what coaching has arrived at, because there is a general viewpoint. And I was being told I'm confusing the public by talking about wide ranges of reps for hypertrophy and different training intensities for cardio, or that protein doesn't have to be immediately consumed. And I thought, why? Am I being the one who's confusing the public when I'm just representing what science has found, but also what coaches do? And then when I dug a little deeper, then I realized there's people who've propped up into this space of training for females, especially around the menstrual cycle and then around menopause and postmenopause, who make claims that are really counter to what the totality of science has indicated, but also what coaches do every day. And therefore, I chose scientists who work particularly in fields. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that when we use the word scientist, it usually means that they spend their entire career doing one niche area, so they know everything about it. Therefore, I went after real giants in the field in sports nutrition, protein, endurance training, hormones, and so forth, to ask their opinions based on hundreds of scientific papers and publications. What do you think about a specific topic? And again, these voices are often not heard in the public. It's social media, it's very small, it's clickbait, it's sentences that sound really good. But when you unpack it, you think actually that's just clickbait to sell a course or a book or to be advocating for female needs when actually you're doing no such thing at all. And that is really distressing.
Yeah, and what I think I also found quite interesting going through this process was that majority of the people that you have interviewed don't even have a social media presence per se. They're too busy actually doing the research. So it's been wonderful to see you give them another voice in a space where there is a lot of confusion. So any final words before we dive into the first episode?
I'm just so grateful that the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, because leading into the podcast, there was a lot of pushback in Tony, you're adding to the overwhelm and the confusion by saying something different to what the big voices are saying. And we're really seeing a shift in thinking where now the public is asking more of the big names. What is the basis? You can't get away with saying research has shown or what we're finding is. And then when you go and look at the evidence, it's in a mouse study. I think a lot of people realize that you can't just say what you want.
Yeah.
And then the underpinning is either a theory, because females are different to males in this certain aspect of physiology, or females are very different. And then you look at the citation and it's in mice. Mm-hmm. And now that was a year ago unheard of, but the standard is lifted so much that people demand more of the people that are teaching them. And that's really exciting. Just yesterday, I did a post that I almost didn't do that summarized 6 of the experts we've had on the podcast. And I almost didn't do it because it was one of these posts that could be construed as everything you've ever heard about training is wrong and do it this way. But we put it up anyway. And within 12 hours, we had over 300,000 views of it. And the comments were really overwhelmingly positive. And it's this new level of embracing, well, science actually supports a number of different approaches for me to thrive as a female. And in the past, it was females, your superpower is that you have differences. And I always thought, no, that's always been understood, that there are sex differences in metabolism and how we use fuel and fiber typing and so forth. But the superpower is that you can adapt to any form of exercise stimulus at any age, even into your 90s. As a female, you can grow muscle and get stronger and improve bone. That's a superpower. And it's not in a very specific rep range, or if you train in a fasted or fed state or have protein immediately. And these things, I think, do an incredible injustice to the diversity of approaches that are available to females.
Well, I can't speak for everybody, but I'm definitely grateful for the work that you're doing, Tony. So, on that note, let's dive into the first episode that you had with Dr. Laursen Colenso-Semple. Why did you choose Laursen?
There was a enormous amount of misconception around, or confusion, I should say, around training in the menstrual cycle. Secondly, there were voices that had come up that would argue for a female, and there's lots of voices here, that in specific hormone phases of the cycle, you should do X, Y, and Z training, which basically boiled down to when certain hormones were most anabolic and at their highest, you should go for PRs and do your most work. And on other times when you're more catabolic, you should have more rest. So it was kind of few weeks on, few weeks off. And scientists knew that the hormone fluctuations in a menstrual cycle did create unknown responses in humans, in human females. Therefore, many females were excluded from studies because they just didn't know how would it affect the findings. So Laursen addressed this area that was a massive gap in the literature, and she tightly controlled hormone status across the cycle in a number of women and looked at various indices of performance and strength and body composition. Just remarkable work. And Laursen and I had exchanged a number of messages, conversations prior to recording this because I wanted to know what her research found. Because as a coach of 30 years, we would always auto-regulate a female's training around the cycle. That is, for some females, we never change anything. And for others, they would report and say, I'm feeling a bit lax today, or I'm not feeling great, or I've got cramps. And we would modify training on the go. But it wasn't a blanket rule. It was just auto-regulated, which is not dissimilar to how a male might come in and said, I've been slammed at work this week and I'm fighting with my wife, so I'm not feeling my best. So what we do is we auto-regulate. And this is part of the coaching process that is auto-regulated and individualized based on the human in front of you versus a blanket rule that females, when estrogen is at its highest or progesterone at its highest, you should do this. This became known as cycle syncing. And I wanted to know from Laursen, where did it come from? Because it's quite clever that hormones are meant to do X, Y, and Z. And the original findings were on what hormones are doing in ovary-ectomized rodents. And that to me was quite stunning because the initial thinking was if hormones are doing this in rodents, they should be doing this in humans. And it was her and her team's work at McMaster University in Canada that really for the first time addressed this literature. So I just had to have her in the conversation.
Well, that definitely was one of my top episodes, I think, out of the 8. It was amazing to hear Laursen speak about the research that she's been doing. What were some of the things that you took from that conversation, and whether they're things that I think you apply as a coach, maybe changed your thinking or maybe reinforced what you already knew?
It's always helpful to bounce ideas off other coaches or scientists. And Laursen started as a coach before she did her doctoral work. It's important that we don't get into an echo chamber or one way of doing things and ignore other approaches. So it was useful to talk about things in the fitness industry which have gained a lot of traction for females from a scientific perspective and really open up that hood and look at the robustness of the statements. And the conversation I had with Laursen was really far-reaching for the hot topics for females in fitness. We discussed the evidence base for training in the fasted state, whether females should be doing more HIIT training and less lower moderate intensity and the reasons for that, and obviously training around the menstrual cycle. And the big take-homes for me were that you should auto-regulate. In other words, there isn't a blanket rule. And yes, the hormones clearly fluctuate. And yes, there might be fuel differences. But in the real world, they're not making a meaningful difference on your ability to grow muscle or your performance. And that's a blanket rule to which you would individualize. And as I've mentioned, I have some clients that we've never modified anything ever, and other clients where we've had to. And that was really eye-opening for me, that the data doesn't support a rigid cycle syncing. We also looked at the basis for recommendations that females should do more HIIT, high intensity work, and less, because that data came directly from looking at the mitochondrial content in the liver of mice, and also on lactate transporters, again, found in rats. This really shocked me because we've got the highest level of evidence, which is called a meta-analysis, that has looked at comparing males and females at different intensity zones and how they respond. So this idea that females should do this and not that was based on rodents, and the literature ignored that. Those people ignored the literature in humans. I can't still, even after that conversation with Lauren, work out why a narrative would be created that females need specific training around the menstrual cycle, zone 2, faster training, when we've got evidence in humans. It's ignored, and the only citations come from the animal models. And that, to me, is highly disturbing, but is highly disingenuous for every female out there.
Yeah, and as someone who has been coached in a female-only business previously, and also run a relatively large female-only business, I've had these claims impact the women within that program and that space. And it is concerning how the background information of where this claim comes from is very unknown because it's just left out. I think something that you stated in your conversation with Lauren was that in mice was just left off the blog or the paper or the claim itself. And I've watched that impact hundreds of women, but it's obviously impacted also thousands of women. And so to have people like yourself who can look under the hood and go, this is actually where this came from, and we have human research, it is quite mind-blowing. Any final thoughts or anything that the listeners need to know from that conversation before we move into episode 2?
Not everyone is trained in science, and therefore when really big voices make a statement to say females shouldn't be fasting, and females shouldn't be exercising in the fasted state, and females should be, you fill in the blank, and there is a statement of why, because females are different to males, and then there's a scientific reference. I just encourage, you don't need to be a scientist, but go and click the link. Or if it's on social media and there is a reference, go and look at the reference. And you'll find more often than not, the differences in appetite regulation with fasting pertain to what's happening with neuropeptides in mice, or that females have a greater oxidative capacity and therefore need different cardio training in mice. Go and look at it. And sometimes these people have pushed back and said, I don't only quote mice, and they give references, and then it's about reviews in mice studies. So it really is transparency is just not there at all. Yeah. So I would encourage you, after speaking to Lauren and looking at the underpinnings of a lot of these recommendations that are unique to females, the evidence is primarily, not all, but primarily in rodent studies. Yes, of course, there's sex differences in metabolism. Lauren and I agree, these do not inform training practice. Just because a male and a female use different amounts of carbohydrate or fat, or have a different amount of slow twitch muscle fiber, it doesn't change what you're doing in the gym. They are of interest to the physiologist, but they are not to guide what you're doing with sets and reps. And I talk about more of this with Stu Phillips when we will get into that part.
Absolutely. All right. Well, episode 2 was with Professor Paul Laursen. So circling back, why did you choose Paul?
Anyone who knows anything about interval training or endurance training knows Paul and his colleague, Martin Bouchette. These two wrote some of the foundational summary statements about interval training, and their pieces of the puzzle and HIIT training 2-part series in sports medicine is one of the most read and cited studies in interval training history. They also published the textbook on interval training called HIIT Science. I have wanted to speak with Paul for selfish reasons ever since I was aware of his work in about 2000 when he was doing his PhD. So I was it's a man crush, clearly. And I, as a cyclist, I really want to know how to improve my own performance. But anyone who's done my courses on program design and training to train for the general preparation and fat loss will see Paul's work throughout the modules on interval training. In other words, almost everything I know about how to construct work to rest ratios for intervals has come from him. So it was a no-brainer that I would speak to Paul about endurance training and HIIT training in particular.
And with Paul and that conversation, what were some of the things that you took from that conversation that you maybe again didn't know? I know you've obviously been following him for quite some time, but some things that the general public can take and apply into their training.
There was a lot. Let's start with the idea that you can be fit but unhealthy. And that has been a transition that Paul has made by working with a number of super world-class athletes. These aren't just the fit people at your gym. These are the gold medalists or repeat gold medalists at world championships and Olympic Games. And he made very clear observations that your lifestyle and your training and your diet can lead to supreme fitness, but you could also be unhealthy. And that had forced Paul to have a revision of his own approach to getting the training balance right. And we touched upon his nutrition approach and tailor making carbohydrate to your insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance and activity levels rather than a blanket statement, but also the over-reliance on high intensity work and not enough base building or low intensity. And I think that was, out of everything, was the big take home, because in the fitness industry, we tend to approach all exercise as hard as possible. And we know this in the weights room. If the set was not taken close to failure, that set we can consider worthless. We have that same approach with interval training and aerobic training, that unless you're getting up a puff and really revving the engine, you're not doing anything. And what Paul has found, and not just Paul, this is a pretty unanimous perspective in the coaching world, is that the more moderate intensity, lower intensity work or base you build, the better you can do your intensity work. Secondly, the fitter you are, you can get more out of that interval session, recover faster from it, so you can go back into the weights room and train properly again because you're not fatigued. And also that low intensity work is doing slightly different things to what the high intensity is doing. So that's a really good idea of balancing the low intensity with the high intensity. And we talked about a number of different formats you can do with the micro intervals rather than the longer ones. We both prefer, say, 30 on, 30 off, doing for 6 or 8 minutes as opposed to doing 6 or 8 minutes at higher intensity. I really like that up and down approach. But balancing the low intensity and high intensity was really important.
Mm-hmm. And I know there are popular claims around zone 2 and the confusion between the differences in sex between male and female and the benefits being different. Did you speak to that, and what was the outcome?
This is where I find it very interesting. We've got science that has compared male and female response to zone 2 training and to high intensity and to training in the fed and fasted state. So we don't need to go to the animal literature. We actually have human data. Mm-hmm. But what I find even more interesting is coaches who work with the same male and females over many years, often over many Olympic cycles. Mm-hmm. Most people don't realize that when we talk about interval training being compared to zone 2, that's often in a 6 or maximum 8-week study because it's just so difficult to do. And that's what we call a limitation. That's not a flaw in the literature. It's just a limitation that it's really difficult to do long-term studies. Mm-hmm. What we therefore need to pair it with is understanding of coaches who are recording metrics and performance in males and females over a long duration. Their opinion really matters. And in this case, talking with Paul, he has found no sex differences in the ability to handle aerobic work, training in the fasted state, and then the ability to eat back those calories that you would have expended, because there is a legitimate fear that if you did a 2-hour ride before breakfast versus after breakfast, the females might therefore undereat for the rest of the day and unwittingly put themselves into low energy availability. His claim was I think his words were, females can eat the house down just like males do. And I think that's just to be aware of, that anyone, male or female, could then undereat for the rest of the day, and that could have a knock-on effect to your recovery and everything else you do in the week. Being mindful of that is important. How much did you expend? Most people don't even know that. But this idea that if you went for a walk or a 30-minute jog and you did 100 calories, if you're female, you should never do that before breakfast. Let's just call it what it is. It's fear-mongering and nonsense. And it's not based on science, and it's not based on coaching practice. So just things to be mindful of.
Thank you. Really helpful. I think I took a lot from the conversation with Paul and better understanding it, how it's just not such a big concern to walk your dog in the morning without having something to eat, and you're going to all of a sudden lose lean tissue. So episode 3 was with Professor Severine Lamon. Now, again, why Severine?
She was one of the most popular of all the interviewees that we've had. And Severine had done some really interesting work on hormones in females around menopause. She also did a really interesting study looking at the difference between total testosterone and free testosterone and its relationship with muscle mass. And it was after that paper that I emailed her just to do some follow-up questions, which I usually do. When a paper is interesting, I will congratulate the scientist, the key author, and ask some clarification questions. And she was really kind. She got back to me straight away. And then I realized at that point she had also done some interesting work with performance-enhancing drugs in women. And that's a topic that I know quite a bit about because I work in the physique industry, or worked in the physique industry. So I know what goes on. And I therefore said, I can help you out with study designs and so forth. So we got to talking. And then once we started the podcast, it was, again, a no-brainer, because this is an expert who is studying directly the longitudinal changes in muscle strength and neuromuscular function, things like power, pre, peri, and post menopause. So she is just a world's expert in looking at what happens to muscles and hormones throughout that transition.
Amazing. And with Professor Severine and that whole conversation, because I know there was a neuromuscular conversation around a study that she had just done, I believe, at the time of your podcast. What were some of the things that you took from that conversation around bone density, neuromuscular function, and how that, I guess, translates into the real world for someone that's navigating menopause who just wants to get healthy and age very, very well?
I'm going to give it in one sentence, but that was a whole masterclass in female biology and what happens across the lifespan. Severine had 2 computer screens up with all the data to make sure that everything was quoted perfectly. And go and listen to that podcast, because I cannot give it justice in one sentence, but the take home is this. Her work has shown that there are associations with neuromuscular function that tend to decline around menopause. These are associations. We don't know why this happens, but there seems to be a strong association between menopause, menopausal transition, and what's happening to muscle function. The take home for me is that resistance training is your primary mode of exercise for females approaching menopause, going through it, and then afterwards, because the associations are very strong. But they're not, and Severine was very clear about this, they're not your death sentence. They will happen unless you do something, and that something is resistance training. And since her work, there have been a number of other labs to show from different aspects. The trajectory of bone goes down, muscle changes, there could be a loss in muscle mass. And these are often associated with a number of different factors of just being sore, unmotivated, training changes. Whatever the reason for slowing down your exercise or changing your exercise, maybe fearing that you're going to gain too much weight, so you do more aerobic training and less weight training, the take-home message is females must lift weights during that menopausal transition, both pre, peri, and post, and include moderate rep ranges and volume to trigger muscle mass change, and also some heavier loaded work for strength and power.
Fantastic. And as you spoke there, Tony, I think one of the things that came to mind from Severine's conversation for me that I found very interesting is the impact of sleep, how sleep can take pretty much everything away that's positive that training in the gym gives you. And I think for women navigating menopause especially, their sleep is so drastically impacted. And I know you did a post on that as well, so that's on your Instagram. Any final words for your episode with Professor Severine Lamon before we move to Stu Phillips?
It's this concept of the associations, whether they are lack of sleep, disrupted sleep, pain, soreness, injury, tendinopathies, things that are strongly present with menopause and vasomotor symptoms and changing training. Find what works for you, but make sure that you're including resistance training and endurance training to make sure that the muscle just continues. Because as we're going to discuss with Stu, muscle is highly adaptable when you compare postmenopausal to premenopausal. It's the same muscle and you can adapt it beautifully. So keep going, find approaches that work despite sleep disruption, despite being sore. Just mix it up to keep your body exercising, because consistency of exercise is more important than the details.
Okay, and so episode 4 was with Professor Stu Phillips, who I've heard you mention a number of times in your course. So I think it seems a bit of a silly question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Why Professor Stu Phillips? Why did you choose him?
There's a few people who I've had the privilege of interviewing on the podcast who aren't just researchers and experts, but are the world's experts. And Stu Phillips is one of these people in the protein world, by his peers, would be considered as the top 1, or at least in the top 3 protein experts on the planet, which now he's on social media and a lot of the public don't realize this and will write back to him and say, hey, bro science, do your research and you can't tell me what to do. What would you say? This is literally the expert on the planet. And there's a number of protein labs in the world, but Stu would be absolutely considered in the top 3, if not the top 1. So I first learnt of Stu's work when I was an undergraduate in the 90s studying sports science. Already he was doing work with other experts, I think Rob Wolf in the 90s on, back in those days, nitrogen balance. And I've followed him ever since. And there's something about Aussies and Canadians. Whenever I would write to Stu over the years, and he would be written by thousands of people, he was always charitable in replying and always very, very nice. So it was just an honor to have a conversation with him. Unfortunately, we spoke more off camera than we did on camera because we just had so much to talk about of his career over 30 years that we thought potentially wouldn't interest anyone else, but I certainly enjoyed it. And then we thought we may as well press record. So that's why I chose Stu.
Yeah, and that was an amazing conversation. I know it's gotten quite a bit of traction on your social media, and it's also been one of the bigger episodes. So from that episode, what were some of the things that you took from that conversation?
Resistance training is king when it comes for muscle mass. And this is really interesting from a muscle researcher, a protein and resistance training expert, is that we often think it's all about protein. And protein is very important. There's no dispute about that. Yes, you can quibble about the actual amount, but if you're not following a well-constructed weight training program, you are missing 99.9% of the benefit for muscle. And this comes from a context where a lot of people want results without doing something. So they want the protein. You can just ingest that or eat it. And especially with voices that have come up into this space, and that is, estrogen protects muscle. After menopause, estrogen drops. Therefore, you need protein to do what estrogen was doing. And these are almost direct word-for-word quotes from a book. And Stu's point was there's no evidence at all. I think 0.0 is the words that he used.
Correct.
To say that protein is doing what estrogen was doing pre-menopause. It's all about the resistance training. And I've found that really eye-opening from a protein researcher to say you've got to lift weights. And yes, protein synergizes and helps, and you do need a certain amount of it. But don't miss the forest for the trees. Weight training is the important variable because we know what happens to muscle mass, strength, neuromuscular function with aging, full stop. It's weight training that's the solution. And yes, of course, you need to eat protein, but get the fundamentals right.
And just on having to eat protein, and obviously speaking with Professor Stu Phillips, the man for protein, when it comes to having to have your protein immediately after training or within 30 minutes or within 20 minutes, especially as a female, what was his stance on that?
Yeah, there's leading voices that would say that because you are a female and because of changes in estrogen that are protective of muscle, females require a faster entry of protein into circulation as opposed to a male who could have it a few hours later. Well, Stuart has studied this and has shown that not to be the case at all. And I think it's really helpful to get the person who's done that work to comment on that misinformation. Because females then, they're worried. That I get asked every day, almost every day, by females in the gym. They finish training, they say, I can't get home for an hour because I got to pick up something on the way home. Should I stop at the servo and get a protein shake? And they would have never have asked me this question previously until they read a book about this, saying that females have a different protein timing need and it needs to happen very quickly because of sex differences. Well, Stu did the work and he found his word is it's a garage door in terms of timing. In other words, if you have it straight away for pragmatic reasons, or you go home and you have breakfast or lunch or whatever that next meal is, or you stepped into meetings and you can't have it for a few hours. As long as you get your total daily protein in the day, as long as you're lifting weights, then there is no sex difference and timing isn't particularly important. And he talked about the number of protein per day in grams per kilogram of body mass, which is about 1.6 grams per kilo. Yes, you could go a bit above. Yes, you could go a bit below. Ultimately, you have to eat something, but there are recommendations that go really well north of 2 grams per kilo of body mass. The issue with that is displacing other foods from your diet if you don't have a lot of calories to play with. So for many people, it's eye-opening that that number is a lot lower than the 2+ grams per kilogram of body mass. Now, as a coach for pragmatic reasons, I usually just say double your body mass and then that's what you're going to have. But it is probably a little bit lower than that. It's pragmatic reasons only that I would give it 2 grams per kilo of body mass.
And just finally, before we move to Professor Louise Burke, would that be different menopause age, like older individuals, or is it much of a muchness?
Stu has done this work, and the argument is, again, because estrogen is protective of muscle, protein requirements increase post-menopause, and that is a deliberate statement made by some of the bigger voices in the industry. There's work that has compared pre- and post-menopausal anabolic sensitivity to protein and resistance training. And the meta-analyses show that protein requirements do not go up, that males and females pre- and post-menopause, not males pre-menopause, that females pre- and post-menopause respond similarly to the same resistance training stimulus. So the totality of evidence is that pre- and post-menopause protein needs don't change and resistance training needs don't change, and females adapt similarly to the stimulus. So the answer again comes, lift weights.
Okay, so then that brings us to episode 5 with Professor Louise Burke. Tell us why you chose Professor Burke. I know she is huge and I've heard her name many, many times through, your courses, but what led you to select her as one of your speakers?
Louise is considered as the greatest of all time in the world of sports nutrition, and no one debates that. That's just considered a fact. Her textbooks are all undergrad and postgraduate readings. Her popular books she wrote with her husband, John Hawley, I've got 2 copies of just in case I lose one. she's just done the most important work in terms of science and sports nutrition, but she's also been the head of sports nutrition for every Olympic team from, I forget, 1990 to Rio. Just an incredible span. So not only doing research, but actually working with athletes. And that combo is very rare, but very special. Again, it was a no-brainer to have Louise on this podcast to talk about nutrition needs for females.
Fantastic. And I do believe she said that she'd been doing it for something like 45 years.
45 years. Yeah,
Yeah.
45 years as a professional sports dietitian.
Just phenomenal. And so what were some of the things that you took from that conversation?
I loved her humility and openness because she started the conversation by talking about the male dominance as subjects in the studies in sports nutrition. And she said she directly contributed that because they just didn't know the effect of the menstrual cycle on how it would affect training responses and nutrition responses. So they just kind of left them out of a lot of studies. And she and a lot of her colleagues have recognized this and have now done, like Laursen has, a number of training and nutrition, especially from endurance and body composition across the menstrual cycle. So there, in her words, she's atoning for her past sins on this topic now, and our understanding is growing weekly on the menstrual cycle status and sports nutrition and training. I was really interested to find that there were very non-significant responses in terms of carbohydrate refueling, even though we know that females tend to burn a little bit more fat and less carbohydrate. These numbers are so low that they just don't make a meaningful difference. So these are one of the reasons women are told you've got a superpower. You burn substrates differently to males, therefore you need to do something different. And she said, yeah, they exist, but they're not doing anything different in the real world, and they're not affecting training programs. So I found that super interesting. We talked about collagen, that the jury is kind of out at this moment. So the next question was, you're a marathon runner. Do you use collagen peptides to help your connective tissue recovery? And the answer was no. So I find that really interesting from somebody who does the work in the field, that if the data wasn't there, but it might be in the future, if they see a smoking gun, a signal for something, they would be doing it. And she's not. So I found that interesting. We didn't talk too much about protein because she knew we'd had Stuart Phillips on. Mm-hmm. We talked about bone broth. We talked about coffee. It was far reaching, but the big take homes for me was that when you compare the nutritional response, males and females, in the real world, there seems to be very little difference.
Yeah, and just on the differences, I do recall one of the things that she did state, which I thought was interesting, and I also think is quite accurate, is that females tend to have more of a mental block around eating more food. So I think she spoke to a study that was done where when you actually unpack it, the females inside of the study actually were starting at a lower point. They were under eating, and that meant that it kind of skewed the results. So the only real difference became between males and females is that females tend to worry a little bit more about eating a lot of food or eating a lot of carbohydrate because of body composition reasons.
I think that's actually a really important practical point, in that science looks at one aspect, and that is, are there differences in glycogen resynthesis between sexes? And the answer is no. When then they're actually fed and the researchers watch them eat it, there is no difference, despite subtleties in fuel use during exercise. But in the replenishment of it, there doesn't seem to be a difference. And that's a myth bust, because many females are told that there are differences in glycogen storage and glycogen usage. In the real world, no big deal. Mm-hmm. But the real practical that I took from that was that many females do undereat for fears of carbohydrate, for fears of gaining weight, and they will over-exercise and undereat, and that creates a low energy status. Now, of course, that is not sex specific. Males, in my world of cycling, males are in low energy all the time because they want to be skinny. Just watch the Tour de France at the moment. This is something that a lot of guys have dysmorphia around as well. But we need to be mindful, regardless of sex, that if it's a code name for a mild eating disorder or body dysmorphia, watch the refueling strategies. And if time-restricted eating or fasting and training in the fasted state are all approaches to improve one's health, but really they're just a cover for an eating disorder. We need to be on top of that to make sure that we don't get the negative consequences of being in low energy availability for too long.
Absolutely. And one final thing on Louise that I remember from the episode was a conversation around pre-training calcium, which I think was quite interesting. And I think the reason I remember that is you guys were both talking about chocolate milk and yogurt as Professor Burke's chosen ways of getting in the calcium as opposed to a supplement or anything like that. She just took it from food, which just happened to be chocolate milk. But that was something that was quite interesting and I think has actually gotten some comments on your social media when you spoke about it.
Yeah, to my shame, I was completely unaware of this literature, and she recommended calcium prior to bone loading. And I didn't think much of that literature just because I had never dived into it. And what she had done in her team, they'd done a number of studies that looked at what are called calcium reabsorption factors or bone reabsorption factors that go either into circulation or get pulled into the bone. And they were able to show that having about 1,000 milligrams of calcium before bone loading, that the bone took those factors in rather than metabolizing them. And so that piqued my interest and I went looking at it. And there's a number of studies, in addition to Louise, who've looked around that 1,000 milligrams. One study did 1,300, but directionally around that number. And it seems to promote bone factor uptake into the area that has been loaded as opposed to going into metabolism. That's a really great strategy. And this is actually probably one of the times that I would change my approach on fasted state training, which as a general rule is, I don't really care. Train whenever you would like to train. For people like me who cycle, well, we don't want to eat and then go for a ride because we fill out our Lycra more than we already do at my age. And this idea that because you're a female, you should never do it. Well, that's based on rodent studies. And let's call it for what it is. If you're going to say that it's going to change appetite suppression, quote the study and say it was in mice, okay? And in terms of fasted and fed, we've got data that shows there is no difference. So I've just got a really ambivalent view. Like, do whatever you want. And if you want to promote a bit more fat burning capacity because you're always hangry just to challenge that pathway, do a bit more fasted state. If you're always in the fed state, just mix things up a little bit. You're not going to die. In fact, you might even get some interesting adaptation. But the one time I would change it is if you are osteopenic or osteoporotic, you might want to eat a high calcium meal like yogurt or milk prior to the bone loading. So that's one where I've definitely changed my approach on these conversations.
I think, yeah, that's a really helpful piece of advice. Now, for episode 6, this was something a little bit different for you, Tony, and this was your sit-down conversation with the wonderful Craig Hall. So, tell us a little bit about why Craig, a bit of maybe his background, who he is. He, somewhat like Severine, is a little bit hard to find on the internet. So some context maybe to who Craig is and why you chose him to be a part of this series.
Well, both Severine and Louise are not really active on social media. Severine not at all, and Louise a little bit on X, Twitter. But Craig is not. And the reason why I chose Craig is because as a coach, I get asked a lot of questions that I have no idea about. In terms of fitness, nutrition, exercise, if I don't know the answer, I know how I can find it or I could deduce it. But when it comes to why people don't stick to exercise, why people have a struggle to motivate themselves to do what is right for their health, that they know what is right, anything in the psychological sphere, I've got no familiarity with whatsoever. And that is by far the hardest area when I know it needs a psychological answer, but all I know is the physical. Or just do more, just do it. And these things they're not helpful. Mm-hmm. I wanted to sit down with Craig, who is a mindset, a life coach, a counselor, who has worked at all levels, males, females, young, old. Even my kids have had conversations with Craig to help reframe their perspective, the inner dialogue, and ways of looking at things to take ownership of where we need to take ownership and where to let things go. And this was by far my most vulnerable conversation because I was way out of my depth talking about perceptions and my inner language and how we can view the world in different ways. I don't really have a summary for this one, except it was such a potent conversation on understanding what makes us tick and how we can get more out of ourselves by asking better questions and taking ownership and accepting things about us. That's, if you're going to listen to any conversation, listen to that one with Craig, because this is not my area. You just have to get it from him. Such a beautiful man.
Yeah, it was a phenomenal conversation, and I do believe there was a concept of a mirror, if I'm not mistaken, that was quite an eye-opener for you when you first came across that, or Craig brought that to your attention.
The mirror was very confronting. So whenever we have a strong feeling about someone or something, Craig would say is typically a mirror that we're looking at something we don't like in ourselves or something that we haven't yet accepted that is true, typically about ourselves. And it comes back to this ownership. And that ownership is I own that and accept it and then do something about it. And he walked us through those steps of it's pointing back at you and this is what it means. And you have to accept that first. And he would use language of it's okay. I feel stressed in these situations and that's okay. My body has changed. I'm not as fit as I used to be. I don't look like I used to be. And that's okay. And then that puts us into a position to do something about those thoughts and that inner dialogue. But I love that mirror, that it's something we don't like about ourselves or something that we just haven't accepted yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And that episode, it was full of both the deep dives into the mindset and why we do different things, but also a high level of practical application that if you didn't have access to someone like Craig in your life, but through listening to that episode, he gave some really key tools to apply to your life to unpack the inner workings of our minds, so to speak.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
any final thoughts or suggestions or anything from your conversation with the lovely Craig?
It's a topic that for many people in the fitness industry we ignore because we're after physical things. But our emotional fitness often doesn't align with our physical fitness. And doing work on ourselves to understand ourselves better, our inner dialogue, what makes us tick, how we view the world is just as important as the physical. And people like Craig, his forthcoming book is all about building emotional fitness. Simply must-haves in our overall health arsenal.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. Okay, so now we move to the second last episode of the summary, which is episode number 7. Dr. Rosalba Courtney. This was all about breathing techniques. Tell me a little bit about why you chose Dr. Rosalba.
Decades ago, I realized that there were an enormous amount of breathing pattern disorders, primarily in my female clients. Because they wear a crop top and the stomach is revealed, you would often see the abdomen never moving or even worse, kind of drawn in, and all the breathing would occur up in the trapezius and the scalenes, and you would see eventually these muscles becoming hypertrophied and overdeveloped. And I worked out pretty quickly around the early 2000s that I needed more awareness about breathing. Didn't learn a thing about it at university, just observed it in practice, especially around females. Therefore, I sought after the leading textbooks on this topic, and one of the authors in a number of these books, often multi-authored books, was Rosalba Courtney. And this name kept coming up and up again, and then I'd looked at her research on PubMed, and I thought, this is really useful. There's a number of different strategies, Boutagy, box breathing, deliberate slow exhalations. So I learned a lot about her. And then I realized we were living in the same suburb on Sydney's northern beaches. And I sought her out, and we went and had a cup of tea together, and really ended up being a multi-hour conversation long, long ago. And I have stayed in touch and sent her all of my clients who have a breathing pattern disorder, because I can deal with the basic stuff. But when it comes to deeply entrenched paradoxical breathing or chest breathing or anxiety responses, I don't know what I'm doing. So I just send to an expert in that field. As one of my good friends and clients, Dr. Adrian Cohn, always says, I don't need to know everything in medicine. I just need to know people who do. I've found that to be an enormously freeing and helpful bit of advice. When it comes to breathing, I send everyone to Rosalba.
And that was such a powerful conversation, again, with the same as with Craig, and I think with all of the conversations you've had, there are so many practical elements. With Dr. Rosalba Courtney, there were things that she took you through in real time in that conversation. You're actually doing a breathing technique. So what are some of the things that you took from that conversation? Was there any new pieces of information or learnings for yourself?
I was touched by how relaxed she was with definitions of breathing disorders. Firstly, I would have thought a little bit more rigidly that breathing has to look like this, and the diaphragm must be pushing out laterally and front and back, and it has to be like that at all times. And she was like, well, it depends on the situation, and under high ventilation, it could look like this. And when you're relaxing, you probably want it more like this. And the exhalation could be more in line that way. And for somebody like me who counts reps all day, is it 3 seconds? Is it 5 seconds? How long should it be? So, well, you could try doing it slightly more this way and a little less that way. And just having the conversation, my stress levels just dropped, and I found myself breathing slower anyway because she was just so relaxing. She should read audiobooks, by the way, because her voice is just so soothing. And yeah, we walked through a number of different breathing patterns, pluses and minuses, whether you want to get aroused or whether you want to fall asleep. If you wake up in the middle of the night and your heart's racing and you can't get back to sleep, different breathing techniques with having that slower exhalation. We talked about nose breathing versus mouth breathing. It was just a wide-ranging conversation, but it wasn't as definitive as I was thinking it was going to be, that this was the solution to every problem that we have. There's actually a number of different solutions, and we can find one that works best for you.
Yeah, I also found it quite interesting that, like a lot of the conversation, it's all very individualized. Even something that Dr. Courtney spoke to about the first thing that she would do with a client patient is just actually see how many times they were breathing in a minute.
Right.
Before even applying anything. There was no like, oh, you've come to me with this problem and you get this solution. It was, let's check in, let's see where you are at individually, and we'll go from there.
And this doesn't, of course, work on social media that wants a clickbait, one sentence, a simple answer. But the sooner we all accept that health and fitness is context, individualized, many different answers from which we can choose, it frees us from, oh, I didn't do 5 sets of 5, or I missed my protein window, or I happened to walk the dog before breakfast, and because I'm a female, I'm going to respond negatively. What touched me is speaking to Rosalba about all of these individuals is that there's context and there's so many different approaches, and maybe we just need to stop being so stressed about all of this.
Absolutely. And one final thing for Dr. Courtney was the beetle. The patient that she had that had thought that I think they came to her as an osteo, something to do with their rib cage, and they thought that they had actually inhaled a beetle. But it actually was just when she sat with that person, and this was, I think, a big driver for her to get into breathing at the level that she has, was that this particular patient had actually this laundry list of life things. I think his partner had left him, lost his job, and just an accumulation of high stress circumstances. And the beetle had become the cause for him to arrive in front of her, but it wasn't the solution. He had not inhaled a beetle. It was not in his chest whatsoever. But she could not have done anything to him physically that would have helped the situation. And so she had to then go down the path of, how do I calm this person's breathing? I thought that was quite interesting.
So it's just so many take-home messages for all stages of life, whether you're a parent and a kid is having an anxiety attack, or whether you're a grown-up and you're having an anxiety attack. Being aware of our emotional state and what it's doing to our breathing, and then having these tools to breathe through the nose and to slow down the exhalation and to get a certain number per minute. These are all really helpful tools for everyone at every age of life. I certainly use them with my young kids. I use them with myself. Was very, very helpful.
So any final take-home messages or pieces of advice from the conversation with Dr. Courtney before we move to the final episode?
Well, she's got a new book, which is one of the breathing pattern disorder books. It's now in its third edition, originally started by Leon Chattow, has sadly passed on, and she is stepped in to take that editorial role. And I think that's going to be out very soon. So I'm going to add that to my first and second edition that I've got somewhere in this disorganized library of mine.
Well, fantastic. We can add that book to the show notes. So episode 8, the final episode for today's summary, and that's with Professor Tommy Lundberg. So tell me about why Tommy.
2 reasons. Firstly, he has done a lot of the really good practical work on something that's very important in the fitness industry, and that's called concurrent training. Concurrent training is where in the same week you do resistance training and aerobic training. Conventional wisdom says you can't do that because when you do endurance training, you will blunt your gains from the gym. So anyone looking to get stronger or more muscle, they would never do aerobic training. One early mentor of mine said the longest aerobics he had ever done was going from his house to the letterbox. Other than that, he drove everywhere. And that was how a lot of people, maybe not as extreme, but just view the specificity of training. If you want muscle, then you just do muscle stuff. You never do endurance work. And Tommy did very, very clever work looking at muscle metrics, muscle function, and endurance training, and then did a lot of reviews on that topic. The spoiler is that aerobic training does not interfere with muscle mass and strength, maybe a little bit of power if you're in a power-oriented sport. So concurrent training is recommended because for health, you need high cardiorespiratory fitness because that is strongly, probably the strongest association with all-cause mortality and longevity. It beats everything else. So we want high levels of cardiorespiratory fitness, but we also want muscle strength and muscle mass because they decline with age. We need both, which means you have to do them in the same week. So his work was key in my understanding of actually changing my viewpoint, which was very strength-oriented until reading his work, and then how we do that in the same week. He also has written one of my favorite textbooks called The Physiology of Resistance Training, and I liked it so much because it's just so practical. Every chapter is usable for me as a coach in the fitness industry. Again, it was one of these ideas of who can I interview who's done resistance training work that is directly applicable to the fitness industry. Well, Tommy was chief amongst those names.
It was actually a phenomenal conversation. You both, I think, because you understand each other's worlds so well. It was such a great synergy and conversation about this research and how that's applied practically, and even how you apply it to the women who are, I guess, the majority of your clientele between their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s. So what were some of the things that you took from that conversation?
The idea that we often view muscle in the same way that bone is viewed through menopause. In other words, through the menopausal transition, there is a sharp decline in bone mass. There's also associations that muscle mass and strength decline as well, but he is part of the biggest longitudinal study from 16 years old to 68, I think, at the next time point. And they're able to very closely track these women across the menopause transition. And yes, bone changes, but there's very little change in muscle mass across that transition. Now, that's really interesting as a point number one. Point number two, that studies that have compared premenopausal and postmenopausal females respond the same way to a resistance training program. This is just the best news because although bone is declining, resistance training is a potent stimulus for bone. but you can adapt a female muscle to the same resistance training program post versus pre. So this is really good news for females.
Yeah, and I think what I took from that conversation was that it was very clear that there's no gender differences to response to the training, and again, just layering on kind of what everybody you have interviewed has said, which is resistance training. It seems to just be this key pillar that we all need to be applying, no matter how young we are, how old we are, what our goals are. If we want to live and age well, it's just a tool that we all need to be leveraging.
That's the summary statement for all of the physical-oriented podcasts that we've done, is that for whatever aging will do to health and fitness and every organ system underneath that responsible for those changes, exercise can stop and reverse. And we don't put all of our eggs in one basket. It's not just we need to run or we just need to lift weights. We need both of them. And that's where the prescription of typically 3 days in the weights room, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, typically total body. And then the other 3 or 4 days would be spent doing aerobic training, where most of that time would be spent at moderate intensities, because that is a way of getting adaptation, but without overly taxing the body from the weight training sessions. Weight training is taxing. So therefore you need something easier. And that's where, for lack of a better word, zone 2 training comes in on the other days. But to rev the system in the last 10 or 15 minutes to get really profound changes in VO2 max, you don't need much of it, and too much of it's stressful. And that's what we're learning from Paul Laursen's work, that you can overdo the HIIT training. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday, total body weights room. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday would be spent doing cardio work, mainly zone 2, with a little bit of intensity work at the end, maybe 10 minutes of 30 on, 30 off. And in that way, we're going to tick the box for muscle, strength, power, bone, metabolic health, cardiovascular fitness. It has it all. And within that, according to Stu's work, is that you want to stagger the reps or vary the reps across a wide spectrum. It doesn't have to be heavy. Of course it can, but it can be moderate as long as you're working with effort. And bone and muscle respond to all different loads. And when we have that viewpoint, you can, what we call as coaches, periodize your training year to do some work around 12 to 15 reps and some around 4 to 6 reps and some around 10 to 12 reps. And you spend time in different zones to give your joints, your bones, your muscles exposure to different types of muscle contractions and stimuli and so forth. And just mix it up. This is not confusing. It's varied, it's usable, highly applicable advice for all females to age in the best possible condition.
So beautifully put, Tony. I was literally asking in my mind, the next question was going to be about exactly that. So you beat me to it, which is fantastic. And I just stayed quiet so people that are listening can take notes on how to practically apply all of this in their life. Because I think that's a big thing for a lot of people, is how do we just get clear, accurate advice that we can apply. It's not overwhelming. It's not going to take up my whole life because everybody's busy. They're navigating a lot of things. So wonderful summary. With Professor Tommy Lundberg, is there anything else to speak to before we wrap up and find out what's next for the podcast?
I found it interesting that he views resistance training as slightly different goals. So if muscle mass is your goal, because muscle mass declines, it's the slowest to decline, but it does decline, is that you want more volume and effort-based training. So typically slightly more sets, slightly more reps, and working close to failure. If strength is your goal, then it's typically fewer sets, heavier loads, and more rest between the sets. But you don't need as much strength work as you need for volume work for muscle mass. And for power, you need to work lighter loads, but with high velocity, or at least intention of moving quickly. And we can put all of those into one program where we have high velocity, high loads, volume, Or you can periodize them and go from volume program for a month to heavier loads for a month to higher speed for a month. There's lots of tools in the toolbox that, frankly, as a coach, I use all of them because you're going to train for decades, not just 6 weeks. So lots of different options there.
Okay, so as we are coming to the end, to wrap up, a couple of questions for you, Tony. One, what's next for the podcast?
We still have a number of episodes to record in this series. We've got the godmother of resistance training for older individuals. She literally started this whole research intervention for falls prevention, bone mineral density, and growing old with muscle. So I'm so excited for that conversation in a few weeks. We've got conversations with experts in nutrition and dietetics. We've just recorded a podcast due to come out with Scott Trappy, who's studied the aging athletes in males and females for 40 years. That was one of the best conversations I've had so far. So that's just about to come out. And I think there's a few others we've got in the lineup as well. So we're going to go out with a bang. And we've got a female expert in interval training who's done work in the fasted and fed states. I'm really excited to talk with her about their findings on sex differences and adaptation to aerobic training, high and low intensity in the fasted and fed state.
Some amazing conversations still to come. The list does tend to keep growing, so we'll see who else is added.
Originally, it meant to be 6 people, and then it went to 8, and what are we at, 12 or so now? So
yeah, we're heading towards 12 to 14, so
it could be the series that never ends.
Let's hope so. Okay, so that's what's next for the podcast. What's next for you, Tony? Courses. I know you've got a number of things that you've been doing for quite some time now. You've also had the menopause course that we've just rolled out. It's wrapped up last week. I think you're at the last Q&A tomorrow. So what's next for you? And then we'll talk a little bit about a solo Ask Me Anything podcast.
Right. I really enjoyed preparing and delivering the work for the course on menopause, training females through menopause. And that really opened me up to the sheer amount of misinformation in this group. It's a vulnerable group that would kind of believe, not to put this negatively, but believe anything. If somebody seems to be advocating for female health, they can sell them supplements and weighted vests and specific styles of training that when you look at the research or speak to coaches, I don't think so. I've really enjoyed that course, so much so that we'll roll that out again. And it'll allow me to catch up on a bit of the reading that I just wanted to include in this course, but just couldn't for time. And so I'll probably contribute more information to that course. As always, I'm coaching. I'm in the gym 3 days a week. I do close to 30 hours a week of face-to-face coaching, males and females, which keeps the tools sharp, so to speak. So a few days education and most of the time coaching. And obviously, it's the Tour de France. So the next 3 weeks, you won't find me anywhere other than riding my bike and watching replays of the tour.
Sounds wonderful. So now the final question before we close it down will be, will you do an Ask Me Anything solo podcast soon where the audience can submit their questions, ask you what it is that they would like to know from you about your conversations, your experience as a coach for 3 decades, anything that they're wanting to know, whether they're the general population or whether they are coaches, because I know you've coached close to 50,000 coaches in your time. So whether they're coaches wanting to advance their skills, will you host a podcast soon where people can essentially ask you anything?
All right. I'm game. Yeah, I'm in.
Perfect. We will get some emails out, get some posts out, get some questions and schedule that. Well, thank you, Tony. Appreciate the summary, appreciate your time. Any final words of wisdom from you before we wrap up today?
No, just a big thank you to all of you who have listened and given such kind feedback. I've been very touched to receive messages every day of how the interviews and the material has helped them dispel the confusion. They feel less overwhelmed with clearer path to go forward on their health and fitness journey. And I could leave it right there and be very happy and proud. So thank you to you all for your feedback and absorbing this work of me giving a platform and a voice to the real experts and coaches who are doing a great job in this space.
Thank you, Tony.
Thanks for tuning into the Stronger with Time podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing or sharing it with someone who would benefit from hearing this. And if you're ready to go deeper, the 9-week Science of Thriving course is available now. The link is in the show notes.